Namaste from Kathmandu, Nepal. Happy Person's Day to everyone watching this video in Claresholm, Alberta, Canada. I want to start my presentation talking about Louise McKinney, Claresholm, and the Famous Five. As I'm sure you all know, Louise McKinney came to Claresholm as a teacher and a homesteader at the age of 35. At the age of 49, she won a seat in the Alberta legislature representing the electoral district of Claresholm. She was the first woman sworn into the Legislative Assembly anywhere in Canada and in the British Empire. She was, of course, one of the Famous Five, who ensured the Canadian women were legally considered persons. In every sense of the word, as a homesteader, a teacher, a lawmaker, and an advocate for change, Louise McKinney was a nation builder. She died in Claresholm in 1931, 30 years before my birth, and 38 years before my arrival in Claresholm. So now I want to look at my connection to Claresholm. During my undergraduate and law degrees at the University of Saskatchewan, I told everyone I met that I was from Claresholm, Alberta, Canada, the only set of lights between Calgary and Lethbridge. I had much to be proud of. I grew up in Claresholm and was blessed with the right to every educational, social, and economic opportunity available to all Canadians. Access to these rights was fluid for the most part. However, my life was not free from patriarchal messaging and attitudes. That is, I was regularly subjected to comments about what boys should do and what boys shouldn't do, and what girls should do and what girls shouldn't do. Fortunately, I never paid much attention to such nonsense. Let's now look at my connection to the Famous Five. As a young lawyer in Calgary, I met Frances Wright, an entrepreneur and women's advocate extraordinaire. Frances made it her mission to see that the Famous Five, Emily Murphy, Irene Paulby, Nellie McClung, Henrietta Muir Edwards, and our very own Louise McKinney, were recognized for their contribution to the building of our great nation. A contribution that gave 50% of Canada's population their rightful status as persons at all levels of government. Frances created the Famous Five Foundation, and I remember her stories about flying around the country, meeting politicians, women of influence and money, corporations, artists, all in an attempt to raise money to raise awareness and create a physical monument to these five women. She was focused and determined, and her efforts resulted in the design of a wonderfully interactive installation of sculptures that have a prominent place in downtown Calgary and on Parliament Hill. Frances' efforts not only raised awareness of the Famous Five, it brought women from across Canada together and provided them with an opportunity to celebrate the contribution of all Canadian women to the building of Canada. The foundation continues to this day providing programming, empowering and inspiring girls, and also empowering and inspiring youth, both boys and girls, to become future nation builders. Next slide. My friendship with Frances Wright and my connection to the Famous Five Foundation provided me with two very wonderful opportunities. The first was in 2004 when I was asked to organize Calgary's public program celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Persons case. That was a decade ago. And this was the year that the Famous Five, along with Thérèse Casgrain, were commemorated on Canada's $50 bill. It was an incredible situation, and it's very sad that they've taken the gals off the $50 bill. In any event, women came from across Canada to attend the event, including sitting women members of Parliament and senators. It was exciting. In 2005, I moved from Calgary to Ottawa, and my second opportunity came in 2006 when I was asked by the Famous Five Foundation to give Prime Minister Howard of Australia and the First Lady, Mrs. Howard, a narrative of the Famous Five sculpture installation on Parliament Hill. Exciting and a great honor. Hey, anyone know this guy? Ted Menzies, then Member of Parliament from Macleod and also from Claresholm, attended Parliament Hill presentation to the Howards. He and I are pictured here with our very own Louise McKinney. Next slide. Now, I'm giving this short background based on the connections between Claresholm, the Famous Five, and myself, because it demonstrates not only how small the universe is, but also proves that Claresholm is, as we have long suspected, the center of the universe. On a more serious note, these connections demonstrate that no matter where we are from, no matter what we do, farm, teach, practice law, we all have the opportunity to be nation builders in the institutional sense. Of course, we are all nation builders through the education and messages we provide to the boys and girls in our communities. No one is free from the role or responsibility of being a nation builder. No one. So, my friends, that means each and every one of you. Think about that. Think about the impact you can have on your nation. It is a daunting thought, but also a thrilling one. Moving from the local to the global. Not that long ago, most residents of Claresholm would have only identified with or been concerned about the actions of the Alberta legislature or Canadian Parliament. But as we all know, in today's world, global events have become have local impacts economically, socially, and psychologically. This has drawn the Canadian government and some Canadians, such as myself, to be concerned about the state of democracy, the state of nation building in other countries around the world. I have had the privilege to work on projects in Russia, Jamaica, and Nepal. Today I would like to focus on nation building in Nepal, as I am now in my 6th year of supporting its constitution building process. Next slide. My work in Nepal. I was in Nepal from 2007 to 2011 as a project director of a Canadian government-funded partnership between the Canadian Bar Association and the Nepal Bar Association. I am currently in Nepal as the head of mission for an organization called the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or IDEA for short, which is an intergovernmental organization with its headquarters in Stockholm, Sweden. The Canadian government is a member of my new employer. In between these two income-generating gigs, I took time off to found a Canadian charitable organization called Women Lawyers Joining Hands, which is focused on providing opportunities and building the capacity of women lawyers to become agents of change in their patriarchal societies. Nepal and other developing countries and/or fragile democracies need to support their own Louises, Nellies, Emilys, etc. As lawyers know the law and can help shape the law, women lawyers are a good group to support to kickstart change. Clearly, the Persons case did not eliminate patriarchy in Canada, but it highlighted the absurdity of the law leaving 50% plus of its population out of national decision-making bodies, out of the halls of power. Emily was a magistrate and Henrietta was a legal expert, and this experience and expertise with the laws and legal system allowed the famous five to organize and take legal action. Women Lawyers Joining Hands focuses on lawyers as they are educated in the area of law reform. However, just as Louise, Nellie, and Irene did not need to be lawyers to dedicate themselves to changing discriminatory laws, Women Lawyers Joining Hands eventually plans to extend its programs to other professions. Continuing on with my work in Nepal, on the next slide, my work with the Canadian Bar Association and now with IDEA focus with providing support to writing Nepal's new constitution. It is not about the women or gender equality per se, and I am not hired to be an advocate for women's issues. However, I am hired to support Nepal lawmakers draft a constitution that will endure for many years and provide political and economic stability. These objectives are impossible if the constitutional provisions do not recognize and grant equality in all matters and all levels for Nepali women, as they constitute more than 50% of Nepal's population. So in order to do my job, it is important that I understand the situation of women in Nepal and that my organization supports the inclusion of women in the process and the inclusion of constitutional provisions that recognize women's rights and advance their equality in Nepal society. As a woman, I naturally expect women to have both a voice and equal rights. Accordingly, I notice when women are not at the negotiating table, and I take steps to have them included. I am also sensitive to the patriarchal attitudes in Nepal, and where possible, and it is almost always possible, I show how the inclusion of women and gender equality is to the benefit of the ruling male elites. This is in line with the recent speech given by UN Women Goodwill Ambassador Emma Watson for the He/She campaign. Her speech was targeted at men and was titled, "Gender Equality is Your Issue Too." Google it. It's worth the read. Next slide. Nepal geography and its people. I want to tell you a little bit about the advances of the women's agenda in Nepal since my arrival in here in 2007. But first, I think it would be helpful to provide you with a brief historical background on this South Asian country, which provides the most popular gateway to the top of the world, the summit of Mount Everest. The territory of the Federal Republic of Nepal is approximately 147,000 square kilometers, and it's situated between Tibet and China to the north, and India bordering its east, west, and southern borders. It has a population of 30 million people, which includes 125 ethnic groups and 127 languages and dialects. Clearly, an incredibly diverse population. Now moving to Nepal's history and its politics. Nepal was traditionally governed by a king considered to be the reincarnation of the god Vishnu, a Hindu deity. Influenced by events in India, Nepal made its first constitution in 1948. Under this document and 3 other short-lived constitutions that governed Nepal until 1990, political and civil rights were limited, and the king had the power to appoint the prime minister, the members of parliament, and dissolve parliament. And for a certain period, he even had the right to prohibit the formation of political parties. In 1990, a large protest movement pushed the king to adopt Nepal's 5th constitution, which maintained the monarchy but limited the powers of the king and created a multi-party parliamentary system of government. The 1990 constitution increased personal liberties, terminated the prohibition of political parties, and established a council of ministers headed by a prime minister, support and advise the king. In 1996, a guerrilla movement led by the Maoists started in rural areas of the country, which destabilized the political system. In 2002, the king dissolved the government for failing to contain the Maoist threat. And although a prime minister was reappointed in 2004, in 2005, the king proclaimed a state of emergency and once again dissolved parliament, suspending the constitution and dedicated his attempts to quashing the Maoist insurgency. Finally, in April 2006, after weeks of protest, the king was forced to reinstate the House of Representatives. The elections marked the beginning of a ceasefire in the 10-year guerrilla war that had taken more than 16,000 lives. The new House of Representatives, with the Maoist majority, abolished the monarchy less than 1 month after its convocation and adopted an interim constitution on January 15, 2007. The interim constitution is Nepal's 7th and current constitution. I arrived in Nepal less than 1 month after the adoption of the interim constitution, and as such, I have first-hand experience of the process to make Nepal's new constitution, as well as the participation of women in its process. So now I want to look at women's political participation, not just in Nepal, but also in Canada. The first Constituent Assembly in Nepal from 2008 to 2012 was elected to write and promulgate a new constitution. However, due to many delays and political issues, it was not able to achieve its objectives. Elections for a second Constituent Assembly were held last November 2013, and this body has recommenced the work to produce a new constitution, and this is the body with whom I am working now. What is really exciting about Nepal's history is how the representation of women has increased over the years, and particularly since the end of the Maoist insurgency and popular uprisings. In the last 3 parliamentary elections under the king in 1991, 1994, and 1999, women won 3% of the total seats in the first 2 and 6% of the total seats in the 3rd election. In 2006, the Maoist government, who were the government of the people, introduced a special measure for women's participation, which increased the representation to 17% of the total number of seats in the provisional government. This parliament then passed a resolution that required 33% women's participation in all state bodies and made provisions for a new voting system that provided quotas to allow it to meet the 33% requirement. And it worked. The participation of women in the 2008 to 2012 Constituent Assembly was 33%. And in 2013, it was 30%. Currently, the percentage of women represented in Canada's Parliament is approximately 25%, and in the Alberta legislature it is 26%. One interesting fact about Canada is that since Confederation in 1867, so over the last 147 years, only 257 women have been elected to the Canadian Parliament. Anyway, moving now to the achievements of the Nepali Women's Caucus from 2008 to 2012, with 33% of the total number of seats. What were these women able to do? And I can tell you, they were able to do a lot. The achievements of these women have been published by the Women's Caucus. They are impressive, and they are the direct result of the presence of women in the Constituent Assembly and the pressure these women put on their male colleagues to consider new issues and look at old issues differently. Their list of achievements includes convincing a government subcommittee to propose including women's rights to inheritance as a fundamental right in the Constitution. If this right is included in the new Constitution, which we're still waiting to get, it will enable Nepali women to run a family and put an end to son preference in Nepali society. They achieved equality in citizenship. They achieved right to equal pay for equal value of work, right against early marriage, polygamy, and forced marriage, equal right to property, and also right to reproductive health and safe motherhood. These are significant gains which would not likely have been raised under an all-male government or constitution-making body. However, and if we go to the next slide, there's still a long way to go. Nepal still doesn't have a constitution, and the Second Constituent Assembly has voiced some opinions that might affect the gains of the first CA. One troubling issue relates to Nepali women's struggle for equality in citizenship, which reminds me of the struggle for personship that was championed by the famous Five. When the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in 1928 that women were not qualified persons as it related to the Section 24 of the Canadian Constitution, a woman from British Columbia is quoted as saying, "The iron dropped into the souls of women in Canada when we heard that it took a man to decree that his mother was not a person." Compare this quote with the current situation in Nepal. Last Sunday, on October 12th, I was reading a leading English daily in Nepal and noticed in large bold print, "Born of a woman." Intrigued, I checked out the subtitle. "A refusal to allow citizenship through the mother implies a fundamental mistrust of women in this country." The article, written by a young Nepali man, contained the following quote. "When it was time for me to get my citizenship card, my mother had to rummage through her belongings and produce my long-dead father's citizenship card. I wondered at this, given that it was my mother who had essentially raised me, since my father died early in my childhood. Still, his specter haunted us like a bad dream, with Nepal's medieval bureaucracy refusing to acknowledge that my mother, for all intents and purposes, should be able to pass citizenship to me through her own citizenship, without having to take recourse to my dead father. In Nepal, men have decided that their own mothers are not person enough to have the right to give legal status to them. Sounds like a bit like shooting yourself in the foot if you are a man whose mother is not in possession of a citizenship card for your father, a conundrum that this young male writer points out. Nevertheless, this is what the women of Nepal, elected and unelected, are currently fighting against. The situation proves that the absurdity of the law is not limited by boundaries of geography or time. In Canada, women fought to person up to sit in the Senate. In Nepal, they are fighting to person up to keep their children from being stateless. Next slide. We now want to look at the legal absurdities and gender balance. One thing I know for sure is that a world in which laws are only made by men will continue to produce absurdities. That is, if only one gender has the majority of power, then the perspective of only one gender is being represented in laws and policies that affect all people. Women are 50% or more of every nation on earth. Without proper representation of both genders, the government of any nation not only fails to represent its people, it fails to achieve its true potential. It is frustrating that 85 years after 5 determined women achieved legal personhood for Canadian women, we are still fighting for gender equality in Canada. It is frustrating that after obtaining agreement from the first CA that women could pass on citizenship to their children, that the second CA is now considering reversing this decision. I have absolutely no patience for patriarchal attitudes and practices, and I'm inherently incapable of accepting any attempt to limit my opportunities or the opportunities of others just because I am a girl. During law school, my reaction to such injustices was affectionately, I think, referred to as the wrath of Meyer. I have since learned to temper how I express my impatience, but I remain steadfastly opposed to inequality. That is why I get up every day and fight for gender equality, as well as equality for all people, regardless of their race, religion, sexual orientation, etc. So I want to go to the next slide and just point out a few final thoughts. Before closing, I want to touch on two things very briefly. The first relates to the issue of equality for everyone. I am sure you are all familiar with the criticism of Emily Murphy being a racist. Maclean's magazine called her a bigot and wrote, "Murphy might have believed all women were persons, but she wasn't so sure about pretty much anyone who wasn't as lily white as her." I have encountered almost the exact same hypocrisy here in Nepal. As I mentioned, Nepal is an extremely diverse society with 125 ethnic groups. Only a few of these groups have been politically and economically advantaged for more than 2 centuries. Women from the elite class have naturally been the first to have access to education and other tools to become leaders of the women's movement here. One very strong advocate for women to have 50% quota in all government bodies told me one day that she could not agree with the Constitution setting quotas for various ethnic groups. When I asked her why women should receive a quota to reflect their proportion of the population, and yet the minority and historically advantaged ethnic groups should not, she said that was different. When I asked how it was different, she responded without batting an eye, that if quotas in government bodies were given to ethnic groups, then the opportunities for her children to get a government job would be limited. She was blind to her hypocrisy or to the fact that men in her society might also be suffering from the same fear. This brings me to my second point. Only when both genders see gender equality as being beneficial will achieving this goal be certain. I was recently in Stockholm at a gender mainstreaming workshop, and one of my male colleagues pointed out that not all men want the stress of a traditional high-powered job and an expectation to be the financial provider for the family. Yet to say this is to invite ridicule or suspicion from both men and women. Emma Watson points out in her UN speech that men's roles as parents are valued less by society, regardless of how much time they dedicate to their children. Young men suffer mental illness, unable to ask for help for fear that it will make them look less macho. Men, she points out, don't have the benefits of equality either. And they should have them. Women should have them. Both men and women should feel free to be sensitive. Both men and women should feel free to be strong. It is time, she said, that we all perceive gender on a spectrum, not as two opposing sets of ideals. So finally, I want to move to my recipe for nation building then. According to my recipe, nation building requires 2/3 patience and 1/3 impatience. It requires patience to understand that each of us comes to the negotiating table with our own perspective. Emily Murphy and my Nepali colleague are not bad people because of an inability to see past their own self-interest. They are merely human. Yet they are humans who have improved the world for others, even if not for all others. Nation building requires impatience on the part of those who are not represented at the decision-making tables and those with enough awareness to support them. A strong nation requires equal treatment of all its citizens. As nation builders, the famous five, the women inside and out of Nepal's Constituent Assembly, and men and women everywhere must continue to be ever vigilant in providing these values in our homes, our schools, our courts, and government bodies at the local, regional, and national levels. Like Emily or my colleague, we may not go far enough, but if we take the first step, history shows others will follow. In conclusion, it is my deepest wish that when you get up each morning, you will ask yourself what you can do to promote equality, and then you will go out and lay a brick on the foundation of your nation. Perhaps we cannot all be as famous as Emily, Irene, Nellie, Henrietta, and our dear Louise, but we are all nation builders. What we say and do is important. What you say and do is important. Equality is important everywhere, every moment of every day for everyone. Your job is to promote it. May the force be with us. Namaste, everyone. Thank you for your attention.